All right, welcome to another edition of the Plus One interview. And today we have founder of Visceral Changes, Mr. Sherard Robbins. You got that big title now. You got the big beard, big title, big beard. Arizona done changed this, man.
I'm here, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah, man. How's everything? How's the quarantine treating you?
It's different, I think, to a degree. First I gotta get this out there. Visceral change, not changes.
My
So I just
bad.
want to. It's all
Change,
good.
change.
It's all good. I don't want people going to the wrong website, seeing the error sign. You know what I mean? But yeah, no, the quarantine it's unique. I think it's taken everybody a little bit by surprise in terms of employment and working. It's not something that is new to me. Even in other careers, I've always tried to make sure I had somewhat of a clause in there that said I could work from home. So that piece isn't too difficult. But we're expanding our family. My wife and I have a baby on the way in August, and so it's our friends really can't get to do the things for us that they really wanted to do, and not being able to get outside and exercise has been a little challenging. But other than that, we're maintaining.
You ain't hit the gym in 2 years. What you talking about?
Right, man.
Last time you hit the gym was after your wedding. That was the last time you was probably in the gym.
You spell Jim J-I-M, man. That's how far away you are. I don't want to hear anything about that.
This guy here, man. There's been a lot happening in the world since May. A lot's been happening in the world. Last week, I didn't watch the video, but everyone saw what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota. In the aftermath of that, we had basically the people are revolutionizing right now. The people are getting the message out. The people are out there being heard. What are your thoughts on everything that's happened the past 10 days?
I mean, it would be silly to say that it's not revolutionary in one way or the other. It would also be equally silly, I'd argue, to suggest that this is something that's new. Protests and the uplifting of Black voices is something that dates back to the beginning of the foundation of the country. And when I say foundations, I mean when the Declaration and before was crafted, because this land is occupied on Native territory. But it was also built on the backs of enslaved Africans. So we have two facets of colonialism and Eurocentric sort of ideologies that were incumbent upon the foundation of the country, but also forced upon two cultures that existed really prior to the expansion of I would say colonialism, for the lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. And so what we see outside is really just, in all honesty, a culmination of what's been going on for centuries. Mm-hmm. I think the greatest difference, and we heard President Obama say it not too long ago, the greatest difference between what we see today outside and what we've seen in the past is the consistent advocacy, and to a degree, of white folks that are out there with Black protesters. I mean, I've seen in some cases all white protests, not just majority. Yeah. And as we know, where the country has a history of making it clear that where white folks feel disrupted, then it becomes an actual priority. And I think that is why we are seeing things hit the waves in the ways that they are today versus, let's say, a couple of years ago with Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice even.
Yeah, with that, going with those protests, you hit it right on the head. There are more white advocates for these protests. There are more. If you look on social media, you see more white advocates. If they see an African American standing in front of the police, if they see a group of them, they put themselves in front of the police because they know their privilege will not let them be harmed. Because if they just stand there and watch, they know that African American will get hurt or harmed in some way, shape, or fashion. What's your thoughts on that? Because it was a small percentage. If we go back to the civil rights, there was a small group of white Americans that were part of the movement, but now it seems like it's more. There's more.
Yeah, I mean, again, I hesitate to put a number on what went on in the past because we didn't have the same accessibility to the visual component as we do today. But what we know of what was available to us, it's fair to say that the numbers weren't nearly as large in terms of what we're able to get our hands on. But I do think a lot of it is generational. To get to the core of your question, I think decades ago there was a culture, a social culture that suggested that here are the roles that white folks play, here are the roles that black people play and other people of color, and then of course here are the roles that men play and women play. And really the LGBTQ community wasn't acknowledged in the same way back then, so we couldn't even have that conversation in terms of dismantling gender roles as effectively as we could now. I mean, really, that really came into play in the 70s with the women's liberation movement and the ERA, as far as the national scene goes. Um, but I do think there's a generational component because um, you and I both don't have to look too far behind us to see a level of order or antiquated, even at times, mentalities that suggest that here's how things should be done, whether it's in terms of discipline or whether it's in terms of living a life that is purposeful and what that actually means. But I think if you polled the youth today, the teens today, who are in large numbers out there, they'll tell you that their purpose in life is very different from maybe our grandfathers and our parents even. Maybe they would tell you that what's right and what's wrong has a different basis in society versus what some of the folks that came before us would argue. And I think by and large that the young folks today are increasingly justice oriented in ways that folks in the past didn't feel. Let me retract. Young folks today feel more comfortable being justice oriented in ways that folks in the past didn't feel the same comfort, I'd argue. The risk that was associated with speaking up on one's behalf in the 60s even was a little greater than the risk that is today because of the social standards of the time. We're talking about decades of the 60s and before, where folks were overtly attacked in racist ways that did not involve protests or certain levels of advocacy in the same way it does today, strictly because of fear of consequences. Now, those fears are very real today. Let me not leave without making that statement clear. But the protections that are afforded to people today, in the way that they arrive, are a little bit are worth noting the difference versus times in the past.
And it hits different for many folks. It hits different for them. You having two teenagers in the household with you, also bringing a child in, sure, it hits different for you because now you have to pass this on. You have to teach them certain things and just make them be aware of certain things, or they may have come to you for questions about why certain things are happening. And what are those conversations like with them?
Yeah, well, you know me, and these are conversations we were having long before COVID-19 even hit. So well before some of the other issues that have arisen, whether it's George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tatiana Jeffries. You know, I've been having these conversations for a long time, just as a black man in America. I've had them with you multiple times in other circumstances when we've had different dialogues. So it's important for that conversation to be had. Little man in the house, he is 13 going on 14, you know, and when he was 12 years old, I used to set him down. He wanted to be a black boy. He wanted to get out there and prank with his friends. And where we are, there's not many black folks in general. And so I just had to make it clear to him that, you know you're not going to understand what I'm saying to you now, but you have to recognize that you cannot do what your friends do in the same way. You can't play a prank on somebody and expect to be received the way that your white friends are being received. And I told him you can't go outside, for example, with a Nerf gun. And my lesson to him was to show him the video of Tamir Rice and what happened when a 12-year-old black boy, same age as him, went out there with a Nerf gun and was fatally killed by a police officer. And sort of showing him the stark differences when it comes to race. And my daughter in the house, she is 16 going on 17, and she's very white passing, skin color wise. And so for her, the conversation is a little more nuanced. It's making sure she understands that she does have a black experience. It may not be mine, it may not be yours, but she comes home to a black household in ways that some of her friends may not, or some of her friends do as well. So to strip her of that verification and affirmation would be just as problematic as to suggest that she is not black at all. And so the conversations are about owning our blackness for what it's worth, and then being comfortable in our own skins at the same time.
Now, what was your reaction when you see these protests? You see they're peaceful, and then you get news. There's looting, there's rioting happening, and then as more information comes out, we find out that the looting and rioting started because law enforcement agitated the situation. They made the situation worse than it should be. Demonstrators are leaving peacefully. Law enforcement aren't allowing them. I just saw a video where NYPD assaulted a man riding his bike. So it seems like even with all that's gone on, some of these law enforcement, they still don't get it. They're still practicing these old ways. And I believe it's just department wise, it's just tradition for them. It's something that happens in their department, and they just stuck in their ways.
And you nailed it. You answered it for me. I've always argued that people would say, some of these officers are of color. Like, how do you explain that? I've always said the issues in that case when it comes to police officers was in the academy. That's where the issue lies. It's somewhere in the training. I'm not an officer. I've never been through this training, so I'm speculating. I also know folks who are in the police academy, and so I'm combining two worlds here in my response to you. It's something within the academy that does not do enough to disrupt the social stigmas of society in the United States of America. I'm not going to say they're not doing anything to try to help alleviate, but they're not doing enough to disrupt it. So, for example, and I don't know if this happens, but if a conversation from the chief is, so remember, a criminal can look any race, so just be mindful of that as we're out there. That's not enough. That's not enough to disrupt decades and centuries of implicit bias. We need something more diligent, something more intentional, and this could be happening. I just don't know if it is, and evidenced by the reoccurring events of law enforcement and anti-blackness in that relationship. I'd have to argue that I have a point to make here, and it's worthwhile stating that particular assumption. And again, some folks I know in law enforcement would say that the training isn't diversity based in the way that maybe you and I would like to see. But when I see law enforcement agitating, as you're saying, I find that very problematic. But I also find it a symptom of the direction in which the president of the United States, the person who's supposed to lead the country, is taking it. He calls himself the law and order president. And I think he's inflamed a lot of individuals in the police academy to take offense to protests, whether it's peaceful or otherwise. Because a protest, remember, shows resistance to authority, or in this case, the government. And although that is your First Amendment right, afforded to you in the Bill of Rights, and supported by every state, courtesy of the 14th Amendment, it's still a resistance to leadership. And Donald Trump is the kind of person who would take offense to somebody resisting, even if it is in the name of social change, even if it is peaceful and or respectful. And I think there are some folks in the police academies and law enforcement who support his position, and those might be the folks we see agitating in certain ways, and they need to be held accountable.
Yeah, and we could just see by how he tweets, how he responds to things that he don't like. When someone challenges him, he'll belittle them, he'll crack jokes, he'll just do everything to disrespect them if they don't take his side, because he has this authoritarian mentality. He wants to be a dictator, and when people give him backlash, he unleashes on them.
That's correct. And he does, he'll recite, he'll try to recite to the best of not even to the best of his ability, or to the best of his ability, which is very finite in this field. He'll try to recite legal statutes or some sort of policy that says he can enact certain authority, and it's just completely wrong. I remember one time I heard him say that the president's authority is total, and that's the first thing you learn in law and politics is that is not the case. And so you're right when you say he wants to be a dictator. I mean, he's very clear about that.
Yeah. We've also got something that's also going on that isn't getting as much media attention that it deserves. I had a conversation with someone about this yesterday. It's, Breonna Taylor has kind of been forgotten about. It's been brought back. FBI launched an investigation into it, but she has kind of been forgotten about. And also there's been news of, this has been happening since last year, that trans women of color have been getting killed, and it gets little to no media attention.
Yep.
It's for some reason the country doesn't. This country has a history, or the world has a history of not valuing women, and we're seeing it now with the attention that certain homicides and deaths are getting, because they should be equal. But we're talking about George Floyd, and we have yet to talk about any of the trans women of color that have been killed.
I mean, that's absolutely true. And what you're reciting are symptoms of a patriarchal, heteronormative, racist society, where the dominant identities and all of those are heterosexual folks, men, and white folks. And so where that has been the narrative for centuries, I mean, since the country, as we understand its inception, you have to imagine that the power structure is designed to support that agenda and no other gender aside from that. Listen, I'm going to answer your question, but I want to preface by saying, you know me, I've held plenty of men of color initiatives at various institutions and even just in Congress and in community. And one thing I try to make clear to folks is that, you and me, Black men, other men of color, we don't come into this conversation until 1865 from 1789. So we're talking about the 13th Amendment. And then women don't come in terms of being recognized with, say, the right to vote until 1920. And so it's your 19th Amendment. And so from 1 through 12, although 11 and 12 don't really pertain to the people in the same exact way, through 1 through 12 of the amendments, after that's designed for the white folks. Anything after that is it's an addition to what was originally in the incipient design. And so when we start talking about rights for Black folks, we have to remember that these rights for Black folks are in addition to the already cemented rights for white folks, right? And then when we talk about rights for women that come much later, we're talking about rights that are added on to the rights for men that have already been cemented in really the fabric of the Constitution. You don't see she, I don't know if at all, in the Constitution. You definitely don't see it in reference to positions of power, such as Congress or the president, the vice president. And so if we were to take the Constitution by its word, we only see men in there anyway. So it's not a coincidence when we see women not being part of the conversation in terms of leadership practice. When we recite our civil rights idols, we forget Angela Davis a lot of the times. We'll forget Amelia Boynton, and we'll go right for Martin, Malcolm. Baldwin has made an uptake lately, and we'll forget Lorraine Hansberry. We'll forget a lot of women who really did a lot of work. So I want to preface by saying that Breonna Taylor, at least in my circles, we're having conversations, of course. We're trying to make sure that her name is mentioned. But on the average, I'd argue and agree with you that then it's not as prominent as George Floyd. We'd argue that even George Floyd took the center stage and kind of moved Ahmaud Arbery to the back, and Breonna Taylor sort of off the cliff. But it's important that we say her name. That's why we have these movements, so that we remember that she was asleep in her bed when she was murdered in cold blood. And I want to also toss out Tatiana Jefferson, who had a wellness check called on her by her neighbor because they wanted to make sure she was okay with the door open. And the police officer showed up to her house, saw her, and shot her dead in the name of a wellness check.
That was the young girl, right? That was the
she was a young woman. Yeah, she wasn't a child. But
I'm thinking of a different one.
Sure. Yeah. A wellness check called on her by her neighbor, make sure she was okay. Her front door was open, something to that effect. I could have that piece of the story wrong. Police officer came by to check on her, saw that it was a Black woman there, shot her cold, dead. And now they'll tell you a different story, and there'll be other narratives, but that's the piece that I want to focus on, because it even goes to show just the image of Blackness is still problematic to white folks a lot of times and to law enforcement, and that needs to be corrected. And when we get to the LGBTQ community, I mean, the statistics are staggering. We have a lot of nuanced areas to discuss, from sexuality to gender, to race. There's a lot of components there that folks like you and I, for example, don't really have to sit with in terms of our privilege and lack of privilege. And so, by and large, trans people of color are murdered daily, regularly. And they top that list of trans folks who face domestic violence and murders in society. And it's something that needs to be dealt with, but that can only be dealt with once we begin to acknowledge that this discretion, this injustice exists.
Yeah. But just sticking with the topics to women, if we rewind the clock back to 2016, election year, we have the two candidates. Black women were telling everyone what would happen. Black women were leading the charge in trying to get Hillary Clinton into the office. Black women let everyone know what was going to happen if you elect this man as a president. And we saw it once again. No one took the African American women seriously. No one took African Americans' concerns about this current president seriously. Mm-hmm. And also, Hillary Clinton gave us a warning of what would happen if this man was elected president, and no one took them seriously. So it just kind of shows you the lack of seriousness that this country has for women of color, women in general, and African Americans.
Yeah, well, that's no secret, and that's a powerful truth and the unfortunate truth. James Baldwin had one critique of Malcolm X, and his critique of Malcolm X, early Malcolm X, when he was Nation, his critique of Malcolm X was that and I'm paraphrasing, essentially he said his message for Black people is one that they need to hear and want to hear. It's profound, and it gives them a sense of responsibility to do something in terms of correct the injustice in society. He argued that the hope is fallacious. He's given them false idealism, because at the end of the day, the power does not lie with Black folks. The supreme race, at least in the context of social United States, is not African American and Black. So what you might actually be doing is setting these folks up for extreme disappointment, or even worse, once they walk outside of those church halls or the ballroom halls after the speech has been made. And I say that to say to you, the way Black people have been received for centuries is the reason why we are in the situation we are today. You look at the wealth gap. For an easy way to have that conversation, for every $100 a white family makes, a Black family makes $5.04. That didn't just pop up over the last 5 years. That is an incurrence of wages and wealth and inheritance over centuries, when plantation owners were the only ones, wealthy white men, who had access to this particular funds, and then they passed it down. Remember, Black folks were enslaved at the time. We didn't have access to any of that. We break the chains in the 13th Amendment, 1865, but you got to remember the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship, isn't ratified until 1868. So between 1865 and 1868, you're not a citizen, you're really just a resident. It's like you living in my place without paying rent.
Yeah.
So I don't have to do much for you. I can just, you haven't contributed here, and you do what I want you to do. And then you institute Black codes and so on and so forth through Jim Crow laws. All that stuff is designed to keep Black people at a disadvantage. And in doing so, you don't have the opportunity to create or amass any type of wealth or any type of status for yourself. So then you fast forward centuries later, and here we are today, when the narrative for centuries has been Black people are second-class citizens, second-class individuals, and less intelligent. Remember, a lot of Trump's critiques of high-profile Black folks like LeBron James have been a jab at their intelligence. Don Lemon, even, who turned a corner over the last few years, has been a jab at their intelligence. So that the message of white folks and white America not taking the Black position seriously is a result of all we've been talking about, which is centuries-long positionality as a second-class citizen.
Now, as we move forward, the protests are going to continue. People have made it known that they're not going to slow down. They're not going to let their voices die out. They're going to keep going. As we move forward, what do you think some of the steps that us as a people should be taking to make sure we just stay focused on what the task at hand?
Well, so my work is completely in organizational development, really multicultural organizational development. So I try to get organizations as a whole to, in short, take their diversity statement, take their mission statement, and put them together so that their mission statement is a diversity statement, essentially. You want to normalize diversity and inclusion so it's not treated as separate, which is a part of the issue. I say that to you because running a country is no different from running an organization. There's differences, don't get me wrong, I mean that loosely, but the idea of managing people is what we're talking about. And the first thing you have to do if you want to create an equitable environment is to acknowledge that inequities exist. That's the very first thing you have to do. And you'll hear that narrative in any meetings or areas of congregation that talk about dealing with something that's negative, whether it's an AA meeting or any other anonymous meetings. You want to first acknowledge that it exists, so now we can deal with it. That acknowledgement has to come from the very top. I've given so many trainings and workshops and messages to organizations where the top level leaders were not in the room. The grassroots folks were, but the top level leaders weren't there. And if they have the access to power and change. So if you're not there, what's the, there's a purpose of me being here. Don't get me wrong, but if you want that real change, it's going to take a little bit longer now. And unfortunately, we have a president who is not willing to acknowledge that. So the first thing we have to do is find a way to make sure that this injustice is acknowledged. And I think the continuation of the protest is a fine way to do that. Absolutely. The second thing that's also equally important, I'd argue, is for the white folks who see out there, as people say, to keep that energy as the months go on. We know a lot of folks talk about how it's great to be Black until it's time to be Black. And everybody wants to be Black until it's time to be Black. And that's sort of been the manifestation of whiteness over the past 5 to 10 years. You've seen celebrities who have used a little bit of Blackness to get themselves to where they are, or their relationship with their Black fan base to raise their profile. But then when Michael Brown pops off, right, or Sandra Bland, we don't see them folks anywhere anymore. And it was okay for a lot of the social order at that point in time that they didn't show up. Now, because so many white folks are out in arms on our behalf, it's not okay anymore. The social order shifted. Colin Kaepernick, and I've been following you, and you like to hammer home Colin Kaepernick a lot, which I'm happy you do, because at the end of the day, had we listened a couple of years ago, we might be able to address this differently.
Yeah.
But remember, the social narrative at that time was Colin Kaepernick was bad for doing that. He was wrong. The social narrative today is that, my bad, Colin, we need to stand with you. And there are some white folks on my timelines who I can look back to 2017 who were like, if you don't like this country, leave. Who right now had blacked out this past Tuesday on their screen. I'm like, wow. And so the social narrative is what people are paying attention to. And so the two things are we need to acknowledge off the top that these inequities exist, and we need our white allies to continue to bring that energy, even when some of this begins to subside.
Yeah, definitely. Now, let them know where they could find your work, the things you do, all the stuff that you got going on.
Yeah, man. So, you can go ahead and check out the website if you like, which is www.visceralchange.org, VISCERALCHANGE.org. That'll take you to the main website and get to look at all the things that we do, some of the trainings we offer, some of the workshops we do digitally, virtually, in person, etc. I'd also direct you to my book, which is A Diamond is a Diamond, the core 5 components of social justice. It dropped this past January. Really gives a foundational look at what I believe to be the critical components of social justice as a movement. When we talk about social justice, I've learned that a lot of folks aren't really quite sure what they're talking about. And they may conflate it with diversity, for example, saying something like, well, diversity is social justice, or social justice is diversity, when we know all too well that that's not at all the case. And so the book is designed to be foundational, not to be exceptionally critical, although there are components in there. But it's designed for the individuals who want to be allies or want to understand the movement, and so they can have an idea of what we're talking about when Black folks are saying, we need you to check your privilege, or we need your help in the streets.
Right. Also, social media.
At Visceral Change for Twitter and for Instagram. It's also a Facebook page. And I'm not on there as often as I'd like, but you can find me out there somewhere. Probably not worthwhile shouting that out because I'm not really on there like that, but Visceral Change will definitely be there.
Before I get you out of here, I just wanted one last thing about all this. So we started to see more athletes speak up about the injustices. We've seen, as you said, ones who had a different view back in 2016, 2017 have changed their view. Those who had their views in 2016, 2017, they stayed with their views in support of Colin Kaepernick and any other athletes protesting. So now yesterday we see a few players talking about bringing up the military again, disrespecting the military again. And why is it that Americans are so enamored whenever something like this happens to invoke the military?
Americans by white Americans. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
It's interesting you asked that question because I asked a similar question to my wife recently when a lot of the white folks were protesting sort of the stay-at-home order. I don't think I saw one protest where there weren't guns on deck with the white folks. I saw folks in Subway with ARs and rocket launchers. White folks. I'm like, and that begged me the question, what is this correlation, this relationship to protests and firearms for white people? And your question makes me think about that because it shows a level. I'm not quite sure if I have the answer to your question, but I'll dump really quickly on what's in my mind. It shows a fervor for the Second Amendment, which a lot of folks take out of context anyway. But it shows a fervor for the Second Amendment that really allows white folks to, at least as a status symbol, to hold on to a level of power or visualize a level of power that they have in the context of society. So they'll protest peacefully, for example, and then if they protest the preservation of the Confederate States of America, for example, and some of the memorabilia that came as a result, and a black person was out there anti-protesting, counter-protesting, you're only going to do so much when you see somebody with some heat on them, and you might take a step back, and that's an intimidation tactic, knowing that gun is on you. If that gun's not there, some folks might feel more inclined to get a little bit rowdy. So I think firearms still give a false sense of security for a lot of people, because there's no reason why you need to be protesting with guns unless it's a protest for guns. And then there's no reason to be protesting in Subway with a rocket launcher, for heaven's sake, and AR-15s. But I also think that white people, by and large, disconscious white folks, are afraid of what would happen if they had to face Black America and be held accountable in terms of things like maybe like reparations or some sense of equality and equitability in terms of racial justice. This is going a little bit off track. I don't want to hold you up, but I remember being a part of a interview process at one point in time where one of the critiques of hiring a Black man as the overall director from a white person was, "Oh, now I can't make the jokes I used to make." So a lot of white folks and this person was, well, prior to that, they were decent in terms of their advocacy, but you'd be surprised how much of whiteness is normalized in their society that they fear even the little things. If a Black person were to come into power, how that would shift their agenda, not even having to pay attention to how you or I have to shift our agenda every day just to make it back home. Right. And so I think those are some of the things that stand out to me when I see people critiquing, or white folks taking offense to people critiquing the military or bringing the military up, is because that's military and what they stand for is what gives them that semblance of power in terms of what it means to be truly American.
And the thing that's very ironic is the military fights for our right to do stuff like this. That is the irony and all that.
The military, who is comprised of Black, brown, Asian, some Native, Latino folks. Anyway, women, trans folks, the LGBTQ community, they're all over the place in the military. So the monolithic narrative that military equals white American is problematic in its own right. And again, I don't know what they're doing to compete and combat racial injustices in there, which would be interesting to see.
All right. That we could have went another 30 minutes, but
I'm here.
Time hit its course. But can you please tell the people that was a foul?
What? I want you to say it.
Can you tell them that was a foul?
I want you to say what it is. What was the foul? Tell me what it was. Let's don't do half the story. You know me.
You know what I'm talking about, man.
But the people don't. You want me to tell the people? Tell them what?
You tell the people.
Don't edit this out.
No, I don't edit nothing out.
Tell me what it is.
Tell me the state tournament game. What year was
that? What happened? I just want to make sure we're clear.
Lynn English against Malden High.
Okay.
I think it was like down. I mean, this is the final seconds of the game. English player goes to the basket, gets fouled. I swear it was Sherard, but he denies it. He denies he ain't fouled him.
Never fouled in my life.
No foul called. They won the game, and Lynn English was out the tournament.
Can I add a few more context to that?
Nah,
for the people listening. I thought you were talking about when I dunked on the dude, so maybe you weren't talking about that.
Was Salem. You talk
Okay,
about
so
Salem.
it happened. It happened quite a few times when I was in high school. It definitely happened in this game. I remember that because it hit the news. Number one, number two, I do remember that block. There was no foul there. My timing was too pristine when I was a youth. I can't get up now, but my timing back then was legit. And look,
You
you
gotta
always
pause
paint.
that. You gotta pause that.
You always paint me and my. You always paint me and my high school team as the bad guys when. Look, we heard news got to us that your coach is retiring that year. Man, news came to us, and so look, if I put in decades of work, I want to go home to my kids, to my wife, and I don't want to keep being out here. So we wanted to send him home. We just wanted to make sure he can get somewhere. You had seniors on the team, where to get ready for college. We're like, get out of here, hit the road. We'll take care of that for you.
This guy here. I wish I still had that. I wish I still had that game on video. Maybe they do. They might do. I might go back to the school when it opens up to see if they still got it.
They might have it. You let me know, man. But
they got that was such a foul. But
hey, at least you all could have come to the Salem game. You didn't have anything else to do. So
we was too busy getting the Malden girls.
What?
I don't know, man. Hey, Sherard, man. Thanks once again for coming on. You know, you were coming out your cave. Got all that going on. I gotta send y'all baby shower gift, man. It's
Please do, man. Registry is almost done. I'll make sure you have that information.
Oh, don't worry, you getting diapers. You getting
that's
diapers.
On there. Don't worry, that's on there. So
yeah, you getting diapers.
That's cool. It's on there.
That baby gonna be pooping all. You gonna run through a box of diapers, 2 boxes in a day.
What you know, man?
All right,
you got
man.
something out here you ain't tell me about? Huh?
Phoenix.
You up here talking like a vet?
Phoenix. Phoenix.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Right.
My man, next time I get you on, we'll talk more about your athletic days, your basketball, your hooping days. So
sounds good, baby.
We'll get you back on here. You can talk about the hooping and all that, and how you scored 12,000 points in 2 years.
I mean 1241, but I don't really keep count.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's Sherard Robbins. Make sure you contact him, founder of Visceral Change. Visceral Change, I got to correct.
That's right.
He did spell my last name wrong in the email. So we even now. Everybody, you guys been watching the Plus One interview. Have a great day.